In December 2020, I walked the route of London's old city walls with four others interested in the history of the city. The stone walls which surrounded London to the east, north and west were built early in the 3rd century when Britain was under Roman rule. They were maintained and used throughout the Middle Ages. The landward route runs in an arc for almost 2 miles, enclosing an area of 330 acres. At the time when the walls were built, London was the largest defended circuit in Britain, so it must have been a prosperous place worth the expense of defences like these. On the walk, I used an app called Relive, which tracks the walk and then outlines the route on satellite images. You'll see the app draw the line of the walls and mark the location of the city's gates in this video. The number of gates in the walls varied. There were perhaps 7 principal gatehouses in the Roman walls. One, in the southeastern corner of the city, on the line of East Smithfield, was probably taken down when the Tower of London was expanded on that site in the 13th century. The others, moving from east to west, were Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Cripplegate, Aldersgate, Newgate and Ludgate. These gates all stood on the principal roads that radiated out from the Roman and medieval city, and to this day the main roads coming into London line up on the axes of these gates. The A11 and A13 at Aldgate, the A10 at Bishopsgate, the A1 at Aldersgate, the A40 at Newgate and the A4 at Ludgate. As we shall see, there were 2 smaller postern gates too. Posterns were smaller pedestrian-only entrances, primarily designed to allow messengers and defenders to slip out of the city in the event of a siege. Being both little and not directly connected to one of the main roads, they would not have been in extensive use in the medieval city. In the 15th century, however, it was decided to upgrade one of these posterns, Moorgate between Bishopsgate and Cripplegate, to a main gatehouse, bringing the number of principal gates back up to 7. While not in the walls as such, we should not forget either the gatehouse which stood on London Bridge. It was only in the 16th century that London's walls and gates finally became obsolete, partly due to political and technological developments, but more as a consequence of London's extraordinary population growth. In 1500, London was a medium-sized European town with a population of some 50,000 people. By 1600, some 200,000 called the city home, a multitude which simply could not be contained within the city's walls. Each year, thousands of people left towns and villages all over Britain to come to live in London, and they increasingly settled in the suburbs of the city. By that time, London's walls and gates served little purpose. Indeed, they were actually a hindrance to the city's prosperity, restricting development and blocking traffic. In the 1760s, all the gatehouses were taken down, by which time too, hardly anything of the walls remained visible. Recent redevelopment of the city, however, much of which a consequence of the need to rebuild after damage caused by enemy action in the Second World War, has allowed more of the wall, its gatehouses and bastions to be rediscovered. Today then, at Tower Hill, along London Wall and at the Barbican, some extensive sections of the wall are visible. There are 2 signs and plaques which mark the line of the walls and the sites of the various gatehouses. For those interested in the history of London, a walk round the city's old walls is an enjoyable and rewarding experience. We started our walk on London Bridge because for 2,000 years the bridge has served as the most important land route into the City of London. To put it at its most simple, no bridge, no city, no city, no bridge. Londinium was only established as a settlement by the Romans shortly after their invasion of Britain in AD 43, once they had built the first wooden bridge across the River Thames. In the post-Roman centuries, when London itself was abandoned, the timber bridge fell into disrepair and became unusable. In the later Saxon period, as London again became a significant urban centre, the wooden bridge was restored. In 1176, during the century when London firmly established itself as the most important urban centre in England, work began on a new stone bridge across the River Thames. Eventually completed in 1209, this bridge measured just over 900 feet in length and perhaps 26 feet in width. It stood until 1831, meaning it was London's longest standing bridge. Indeed, until 1750, it was the only bridge across the Thames at London. This engraving from 1616 gives us a good idea of the bridge's appearance. As many as 138 shops stood on 19 arches. In the centre, at least in the Middle Ages, was a chapel dedicated to Thomas Becket, London's own saint. At the southern end, where we started our walk, was a gatehouse, which we can see here decorated with the heads of executed criminals on spikes. There was too a drawbridge, which could be raised to allow taller ships to pass. Together, the gatehouse and drawbridge served as a formidable barrier to entry. Well, at least they did if there was a will to defend the city. When Wat Tyler and his army of rebellious peasants arrived at the southern end of the bridge in summer 1381, Londoners, sympathetic to their cause and eager to avoid an assault on the city, simply lowered the drawbridge to allow the rebels into the city. The Roman and medieval bridges actually crossed the river about 100 feet downstream of the current bridge. The line of Gracechurch Street in the City of London gives us a good idea of where that bridge stood. The first bridge actually to cross the river on its current line was the one which finally replaced the medieval bridge. This one was built to designs of John Rennie between 1824 and 1831. As we can see in this engraving, for a short time the medieval bridge, on the right, and the 19th century bridge on the left stood alongside each other. This bridge was famously sold to Robert P. McCulloch in 1968 and rebuilt across the Bridgewater Channel Canal at Lake Havasu City in Arizona. Thus, London Bridge, which we walk across today, which replaced that structure in 1973, is the third bridge to be built of stone or concrete which stood on that site in the last 1,000 years. After crossing the bridge, we turned right and headed east towards the Tower of London. Some 50 years or so after the landward walls were built, the Romans built a mile-long Riverside Wall stretching from Blackfriars in the west to the site of the Tower of London in the east. This was a huge operation which involved piling and demolition of existing buildings. On the south side of the Riverside Wall were the quays jutting into the river. On the north were the warehouses. It was probably around this time that 18 bastions or towers were added to the landward wall's eastern side too. These developments again tell us that London must have been rich enough to justify the enormous effort and expense of this project. But they also suggest that the city was vulnerable to raiders approaching in ships from the east. In those days, the river was wider than it is today, and the Roman Riverside Wall ran along the line of what is now Thames Street. Writing in the 12th century, William Fitzstephen thought that the Riverside Wall had been washed away and undermined by the River Thames. In fact, as the city had grown bigger and richer, the Londoners had gradually encroached further and further into the river, taking more and more land for docks and warehouses, and thereby swallowing up the Riverside Wall. When we reached the Tower of London, we turned left and started to head north. Work on the Tower of London began shortly after the Norman conquest in 1066, with the construction of the White Tower, which now stands in the centre of the royal fortress and palace. For the King of England, the tower served a double purpose. It protected London from an attack from the sea, and, more importantly, it sent a clear message to the Londoners that the king was in charge. For that reason, over the course of the next 2 centuries, various kings of England expanded the tower, both to the east beyond the line of the Roman wall and to the west back into the city of London. The bulge this expansion created in the line of the walls was mirrored in the southwest corner of the city by the Priory of Blackfriars, which too burst through the line of the wall. We are yet to discover the location of the gate which may have stood in the wall on the site of the tower. Thus, The first of London's gates which we can identify is the small postern immediately to the north of the tower, the location of which is marked here by this second pin. It was probably built as part of the 13th century expansion of the tower, and in this Museum of London reconstruction we can see just how unobtrusive this gateway was. In fact, it was of so little use that after its collapse in 1440, no effort was made to rebuild it in stone. If the postern is very much the poor relation of London's gates, the section of wall which remains standing directly to its north is quite the opposite. Here we find the best preserved portion of London's wall, measuring some 110 feet long and up to 35 feet high. It certainly gives us an idea of just how imposing a structure the wall was. We can also clearly see the construction materials. The wall was almost entirely built with squared ragstone that was brought up the River Thames on barges from quarries near Maidstone in Kent. These quarries continued to supply London with stone well into the Middle Ages. In 1278 alone, 304 shiploads of it, costing over £100, were used at the tower as part of its refortification. Transport by barge was by far the cheapest way of moving stone in pre-industrial Britain, but it was not without its risks. In the 2nd century, a barge sank in the Thames close to Blackfriars with around 26 tons of Kentish ragstone on board. Also visible here are the red coursing tiles which the Roman masons used to even out the roughly shaped stone. Heading north from here, pausing to view some of the wall visible under the One America Square building, we reached Aldgate on the site of our third pin. In the middle of the 17th century, Wenceslaus Holler made a series of engravings of the 7 gates standing in the city's walls. We should not think that London's gates always looked exactly as they did in Holler's engravings. Cripplegate, for example, was rebuilt in 1491, thanks to the largesse of the wealthy goldsmith Edmund Shah, while many of the gates to the north and west of the city were reconstructed after the Great Fire, even though they were only of symbolic value by that time. However, gates had always to serve the same purpose, namely to be defensible structures which allowed access to and from the city, and there is no reason to think that their designs ever changed fundamentally. At street level, there were central arches through which traffic could pass, with smaller pedestrian passages on one or both sides of this central arch. Above this were rooms and chambers that were put to various uses. The most famous occupant of the rooms above Aldgate was Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer is of course best known for his poetry, but he was also an administrator and royal official, and it was in one of these roles, that is as controller in the Port of London, that he was in 1374 granted a rent-free lease for the term of his life on a dwelling above Aldgate. It made sense that a man charged with collecting customs would live above one of London's gates and close to the city's custom house. And it was probably in these rooms that Chaucer wrote some of his most famous works. To reach Aldgate, we walked up Jury Street, a name which reminds us of the long history of London's Jewish residents in this area. In the Middle Ages, a Jewish community was known to live here, and according to one writer, in 1215, stone from their houses was used to rebuild London's damaged walls after the rebel barons had entered the city via Aldgate. The Jews were expelled from England in 1290, but they were allowed to return around the time that Holler made this engraving, and it was again in Aldgate that they primarily settled. In fact, as we followed the line of the city's walls from Aldgate up to Bishopsgate, we passed the Sephardic synagogue of Bevis Marks. Built in 1701, it is the only synagogue in Europe to have held regular services for over 300 years. To the right of Bevis Marks, running parallel to the line of the wall, is Houndsditch. This road runs on the line of what was an extramural pathway before a ditch. John Stowe, writing at the very end of the 16th century, believed that it acquired its name from the dead dogs that were routinely thrown into the ditch. Well, you can make your own mind up on that, But there can be little doubt that the ditch outside the walls on this side, which was perhaps 80 to 90 foot wide, would have been a pretty foul place filled with all manner of rubbish and waste. At its northern end, Bevis Marks joins Bishopsgate, and it was here, as we can see with this fourth pin, that the Bishopsgate stood. Its etymology is uncertain, but if you come here, do look for the bishop's mitre attached to one of the buildings overlooking this site, which marks the location of the gate. The road north from here led to the ports of the East Anglian coast, and it may have been for that reason that, in the 13th century, the wealthy Hanseatic merchants, men who dominated trade in the Baltic and North Seas, and who had established themselves in the towns on England's eastern shore, were charged with keeping Bishopsgate in good repair. Another connection between the Baltic, East Anglia and London is provided by the church of St Botolph, which stands immediately without the line of the city walls here. St Botolph was an Anglo-Saxon abbot whose cult was popular in Scandinavia, East Anglia and London, and churches dedicated to him stood outside 3 of London's gates, here at Bishopsgate, at Aldgate and Aldersgate. There was too another church of St Botolph at the Riverside entrance to the city of Billingsgate. This is no coincidence. Among other things, Botolph was celebrated as a patron saint of boundaries and of trade and travel. Heading west, we soon come onto London Wall, a road which more or less follows the line of the wall's northern stretch. Passing along this section, we come to the sites of 3 gates in fairly quick succession. Moorgate, shown by the 5th pin, Cripplegate by the 6th, and then Aldersgate by the 7th. No trace remains of any gate, of course, but Aldersgate and Moorgate are remembered in the names of streets. Aldersgate connected London to the north of England via the Great North Road. As such, it would have stood across a very busy route indeed. Moorgate, on the other hand, was the postern gate which was upgraded in the 15th century. It opened only onto the marsh or moor to the north of the wall here, hence its name, and it did not lead onto any of the main roads connecting London with its hinterland. It was then probably the least used of London's gatehouses. In the middle of the two stood Cripplegate. Its etymology is uncertain too, but the gate in its medieval form may have been substantially Roman and subsiding, causing it to be known as the low, cramped or creeping gate. In between these sites stand some of the most impressive sections of London's fortifications, and they can tell us a great deal about the earliest and latest history of the wall as a defensible structure. At St Alphege Gardens, where a small church once stood abutting the wall, equidistant between Moorgate and Cripplegate, is a well-preserved portion of wall. The most noticeable thing here is the extensive use of brick, a material which only became widely used in London in the late Middle Ages. This portion of wall was repaired and restored in the 1470s. That is to say that at the very end of the Middle Ages, the wall and gates were still deemed important enough to justify the cost of large-scale repairs and rebuilding. Not without good reason too. In 1471, the Londoners were able to stand fast behind the walls and repulse rebels who attacked the city from the east. By contrast, just along from here, running north to south, parallel to Noble Street, between Cripplegate and Aldersgate, is the oldest section of the city's wall. In fact, this stretch of wall was probably the western side of the Roman fort which stood in this corner of the city. This fort, home to perhaps as many as 1,000 soldiers, was built around the year 120. When the decision was taken, 80 to 100 years after construction of the fort, to encircle London with a wall, the western side of the fort was incorporated into that wall. Just to the north of this site, on the southern boundary of the Barbican estate, can be seen a less impressive section of the wall, but some fantastically well-preserved remnants of the bastions or towers which were added to the wall's western extent in the Middle Ages. Much like the rooms and apartments above many of London's gates, we know that these bastions were sometimes let out, often to anchorites or hermits, people who wished to withdraw from society. Moving on from Aldersgate, we walked west through Postman's Park, formerly the site of the General Post Office, and from there between the locations of the two hospital foundations of Christ's and St Bartholomew's. I shall cover the rich history of the City of London's hospitals in another video soon. Reaching Giltspur Street, with the imposing church of St Sepulchre opposite us, we had reached the very northwest corner of the city's wall. From here we turned south and headed down Giltspur Street and Old Bailey, walking parallel with the line of the River Fleet to our right, which now flows underground here towards Ludgate Hill. Although only a short distance of just 1/5 of a mile, two gates stood in this stretch of wall, connecting London to areas which lay west of the capital. Both these gates were in fact used at various times as prisons. Ludgate, the southern and busier of the two gates, marked here by the 9th pin, and which may have taken its name from the adjacent River Fleet as Floodgate or Flutgate, is less well known today as a historic prison. Far more famous is Newgate to the north, marked here by the 8th pin, on which site now stands the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, commonly known as the Old Bailey, after the road on which it is located. There were some 24 prisons in 17th century London and Southwark, but none of them were more formidable than that bottomless pit of despair that was Newgate Jail. The history of Newgate Jail, London's chief prison, is worthy of its own video. Suffice only to say that while Newgate was, as with all London's gates, occasionally rebuilt and restored, the rooms above and around the gate were in continual use as a prison from the 12th century until 1767, when the gate was eventually taken down. At that time, a new prison was built here, which stood until the very earliest years of the 20th century. In this image here, we can see the prison wings on either side of the mid-17th century gate. This building was destroyed in the Great Fire, but it had been rebuilt by 1673. Conditions in the prison were always abysmal. What we now recognise as a louse-borne typhus was known by contemporaries as jail fever, as it broke out so commonly in prisons. In 1750, around 50 people were killed, including a Lord Mayor and Alderman and several lawyers and clerks, when infected prisoners brought jail fever into the courtroom at their trial. Very few convicted felons actually served their sentences at Newgate. In fact, it was only in the 19th century that sentences of imprisonment began to be routinely handed down to felons. Prior to that, criminals were punished by fines, through public humiliations such as a spell in the stocks or the pillory, maiming or branding, corporal punishment, transportation, or death. Some debtors were kept here too, but most of those in Newgate were either suspects held on remand awaiting trial or convicted criminals awaiting transportation or death. Until 1783, those to be executed would be taken from Newgate to Tyburn. After 1783, they were hanged at the prison itself. Until 1868, outside the prison before huge and riotous crowds, and thereafter within the prison walls. It's surely no exaggeration to say that for at least 7 centuries, Newgate was the most miserable and unfortunate place in all London. Well, let's leave the despair of Newgate behind and approach the final section of our walk. In the Roman and early medieval city, the line of walls continued more or less straight down from Ludgate Hill to the River Thames. After the conquest of 1066, 2 private castles were built in this southwest corner of the city, Baynard's and Montfichet. Both were taken down in the 13th century, and in 1275 King Edward I granted the land here to the Dominican friars. Friars brought the word of God into the towns of medieval Europe. In this way they were quite unlike the monks, who usually chose to live outside cities, which they saw as sinks of iniquity and vice. Different orders of friars followed slightly different rules and established themselves in different places. usually just inside the city walls where land was more available. In London, the Crutched Friars at Aldgate, the Austin Friars at Broad Street, and the Grey Friars at Newgate. The most famous of all the friars to come to London were the Dominicans, or Black Friars, who built their priory in the corner of this city. Work began on the site in 1279, as part of which the city wall was taken down and rebuilt further to the west, adjacent to the River Fleet, so that the bulge in the walls in this southwest corner mirrors that of the tower in the southeastern. The priory was complete by 1288, and for 250 years, until the dissolutions of the 1530s, the Black Friars called this part of London home. From here we turned east and headed back along the river towards London Bridge. We should not forget that the river itself has always served as a gate to London, as many of the names of places along the riverbank attest: Dowgate and Oystergate to the west of London Bridge, and Billingsgate to the east. Along here too were numerous quays, wharves, heirs and yards. Although the Roman and medieval city was the biggest and most populous city in the British Isles, one thing which strikes me when I look at this route is just how small that area was. This walk was just under 3 miles long, 1 mile along the riverbank and 2 miles around the landward arc of the walls. Today it encompasses more or less the area known as the City of London, or the Square Mile. If one chose to walk directly across it from the Tower to Ludgate Hill, it should take no more than half an hour or so. In this way it is dwarfed by Greater London, which surrounds it, covering more than 600 square miles of land. True, the city's walls and gates became redundant some 500 years ago. They rapidly fell into disrepair, and today little remains of their structures. However, a walk today around the circuit of London's wall reveals a great deal of the city's rich history.